Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kate Odell, filling in as your host today. First, a happy Thanksgiving to our listeners. Thanksgiving is a holiday dedicated to gratitude and reflection on the American project. And today we're going to explore one facet of that diamond.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
We're going to be talking about a new book titled The American Edge. It's a book about how throughout history, America has innovated and summoned tremendous industrial and military might to meet the threats it faced around the world. And it's a timely book in an uneasy world. Amid a war in Ukraine and tensions in the Pacific, is America prepared for the wars that it may someday fight? Joining us here today is the author of this book, Seth Jones. Seth Jones runs the defense shop at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He teaches at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and he frequently writes for us here at the Wall Street Journal's opinion pages. Seth, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the show. 10 years ago, it might have been hard to command a lot of attention on a book that offers a history of America's weapons production. But a lot of Americans have heard now that the U.S. has a real problem here. America is struggling to build ships of really any class. America doesn't have enough weapons to offer Ukraine for years and years of war. There is a growing public alarm about this. So I wanted to start by just asking, what did you think was missing in the conversation that prompted you to write this book? And distill for us what you mean by the American edge.
So all great questions, and it's great to be on. Thanks for having me. I actually think the biggest single driver to write this, and I think what was missing, was this, on the one hand, the significant growth of the Chinese industrial base, particularly the defense industrial base. I don't think most Americans fully appreciate how much money the Chinese are spending building in all the domains of warfare, from their aircraft, including fifth generation aircraft and bombers, through a massive maritime industrial base that includes, huge shipyards, to land systems, cyber, space, and then nuclear weapons. And there's this almost 1930s moment as everybody's sort of watching the Germans rearm, and few people are doing about it. So that's part of it. The second is all the signs are there that the U.S. Industrial base, and frankly that of its allies, is severely strained. As you mentioned, the challenges with getting javelins and stingers and producing them, getting the production lines up and running, 155 millimeter howitzers and munitions to Ukraine, all indicative of that, and a range of the war games that we've run, where we run out of our U.S. long-range anti-ship missiles. After a week of a conflict, all of these are like blinking red lights. So there's the Chinese activity, and then there's the, I think, lack of U.S. preparedness for it, which were the sort of two sides of that.
Right. And I want to get to China and also some of the great history in your book in a moment. But to stick on Ukraine, where I think there is a lot of attention, I think most of what the public reads is, okay, we're learning a lot about, for instance, drone warfare in Ukraine. That's been an enormous topic of coverage and conversation. It's changing so rapidly, to think back to the kinds of drones Ukraine was using at the beginning of the war, Turkish TB2s, now we go straight to fiber optics. I mean, the evolution, it's very iterative. It changes all the time. And what Americans, I think, hear is that the U.S. military is not prepared to incorporate any of this into their own the way that they're going to conduct warfare. And so I guess one of my core questions here is how acute is that problem? Talk to us about, is the United States adopting this technology faster, or are you optimistic that there is a growing recognition that we really do need to move quicker to get some of these technologies into the hands of frontline troops?
So two responses. On the one hand, and I have been to the battlefields of Ukraine and talked to Ukrainians, and also worth noting, been up several times, talked to the Israeli Defense Forces in Israel too, because they've got a fight that have used drones, among other things, as well. So on the drones, my general sense is that the U.S. certainly recognizes that drones are an important part of the evolving character of war. I would just say where the U.S. has challenges right now is in several areas. One is is the Pacific theater is a particularly important role, I think, for undersea or UUVs, unmanned underwater vehicles. That's an area where there has been some limited efforts to start ramping up, but in my view, definitely not fast enough. What we've seen with UUVs and companies like Anduril that are building them, they're still pretty expensive. But what becomes really important is it's a huge vulnerability of the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army. They can't see particularly well undersea. Their anti-submarine warfare capabilities aren't very good. And if you're looking for ways to make it really difficult for Chinese ships to bring army folks across, say, the Taiwan Strait, it's the undersea dimension, submarines and then UUVs that end up being, I think, a real cause of concern for the PLA. So there's that element that there's just not enough. I just don't think there's enough production on. But in addition, I just don't think at the tactical and operational level, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, probably even the U.S. Marine Corps are far enough along in getting really cheap, attritable drones into the hands of either warfighters on the ground. There just aren't enough right now. They're not producing at mass and scale. There have been some initiatives like the Replicator program, but I would say the same thing on ships. We don't have enough on destroyers and frigates at this point. So there's been a recognition that it's important. We don't have enough, I think, actually at the operational level. And just one last point, I will sort of push back against some who've argued that really the future of war is about these sort of unmanned or uncrewed systems. I think as we see in Ukraine and in Israel, frankly, for that matter, there's a real need for people and land platforms to hold territory. So this is not just about unmanned, uncrewed, and autonomous systems. You still need to control territory, and those don't do it.
Absolutely. I mean, that was where I was going to head, is that there is an inverse risk here of sort of overlearning the lessons of drone warfare and kind of undervaluing that war in some ways has not changed fundamentally, and that Ukraine has taught us that you also need a lot of conventional firepower. There has been, in this rush to learn about integrating these new technologies, some exuberance, like maybe we should just doge the F-35 2 weeks before it takes out the Iranian nuclear program, right? And so I want to flip that a little bit, because I think one of the contributions of your book is talking about how we came to this environment where we don't have very much competition among defense contractors, and Americans have a perception that we have big, lumbering, uncompetitive defense contractors. And so why don't you walk us through the choices we made after the Cold War to constrain that industry, and how that contributed to where we find ourselves?
Yeah, so this gets us to the famed Last Supper. The Clinton administration, as President Clinton is on the campaign trail and then wins election. I mean, he does see a world where the Soviet Union has collapsed. It's a massive international evolution. And so from the defense standpoint, I think the argument is, and it's understandable to a degree, that the U.S. doesn't need to spend as much on defense as it did throughout the Cold War, because it doesn't have the threat of a Soviet Red Army punching through NATO lines around the Fulda Gap and then threatening to overrun much of Western Europe. That threat significantly decreased because the Soviet Union was no more. And so what the administration does is starts to cut the defense budget. And then it has this fascinating meeting. It happens May 18th, 1993 at the Pentagon. I've gotten the notes from that meeting, and I've interviewed several of the CEOs that were invited, the big CEOs from the big defense companies, to have a dinner and then a discussion afterwards in one of the Pentagon conference rooms. And what senior Pentagon officials say to some of the top CEOs, including Norm Augustine at Martin Marietta, and then eventually at Lockheed, is, look, we have suppliers for a number of different weapon systems. We've got 3 suppliers right now who are building bombers. We've got 5 that are building fighter. We've got 4 that are building helicopters, and they go through space, shipbuilding, tracked vehicles, and missiles. And what they come out is a briefing slide, which I got my hands on, of what they want for the future. So instead of 3 companies producing bombers, they want 1. Instead of 4 that are producing helicopters, they want 2. What they say to industry is, you figure out through mergers, acquisitions, exiting the defense space, how you're going to get there. We'll leave that up to you, but that's the direction we want to go to. Defense budgets are coming down. And so there's this scramble over the course of the 1990s for how defense looks. And so what you get by the end of the 90s is a lot of defense companies down to Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, very small number.
What's striking to me now is that, to your point, the U.S. hasn't substantially yet increased its defense spending off of a 3% of the economy modern standard. But you have seen really a lot of innovative ferment in the private economy to try to solve some of these military problems. And some of that you were describing, underwater autonomous vehicles, drones of a lot of different classes, potentially autonomous wingmen that can fly alongside a manned pilot and make a manned pilot's job a lot less dangerous. I mean, really, things that could really help U.S. forces. And so one of my questions is, this is a different environment from maybe 10 years ago, where a lot of private companies didn't want to work with the Pentagon. What is driving this influx of money into the defense space if it's not clear yet whether the U.S. is serious about really rebuilding its military power?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of lay the groundwork as you started off, how much the U.S. spends on defense as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, is actually stunningly small compared to the Cold War. At various points, even during Democratic, say, the Kennedy administration, it was up at 9% of GDP. The Reagan buildup was 6%. The current spending, which is in the 3% realm right now, is actually smaller as a percentage of GDP than even the Carter administration, which Reagan came into office criticizing for not being strong enough on defense and not spending enough on defense. So we're at levels right now that are smaller than at any time during the Cold War. What we have seen, I think, is a massive increase in private capital, from venture capital companies to private equity companies that are buying and selling very specific types of companies and interested in investing in specific types of systems. I think what's happened are a few things. One is there's a lot of commercial interest in some types of defense systems. So think the massive increase in space, which is a big military domain, but has huge applications in the commercial world. If one thinks of autonomous and unmanned or uncrewed systems, huge utility for intelligence, surveillance, strike, bomb damage assessment or battle damage assessment in warfare, but also huge utility in the commercial sector. So I think when one looks at investors, they're seeing in specific fields, aerospace, space, cyber, autonomy, artificial intelligence, quantum, so a number of applications that have sort of big defense, but also commercial applications and a possibility to make money. But also, I think we're starting to see an increase in patriotism. We certainly saw that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where a number of defense companies really step up, and private capital and private equity investors step up and decide they're going to provide help in what they consider a good cause. So, there's been a big mind shift, including some of the big companies like Google to get involved in this space, which 10 years ago they wouldn't have touched.
Right. Looking at the question of whether the U.S. is really serious about expanding its defenses, you do have a lot of bipartisan interest in Congress in the industrial base issue. I mean, it seems like Congress continues to try to devote money to expand certain production lines, but we're struggling to really see a lot of progress there. There are a couple success stories like 155 ammunition, But one of the things I appreciated about your book was you really raised the profile of presidential leadership as singular in driving an expansion of America's capacity to produce weapons. And so is that a missing ingredient, or despite all of this public attention, what is really stopping us from getting better and growing our industrial base faster?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and this is where I think some historical awareness is important, and it's a conversation that I've had with a number of members of Congress too. Senator Wicker, the Senate Armed Services Committee chairman earlier in the week, Senator McConnell, and a number of others. I mean, when you look at the big industrial pushes in the last century, what stand out to me are really the kind of national priority of doing it that it takes. I mean, it takes a big White House push to make this a priority. So there are a couple of just very brief examples. One is the push just before the U.S. becomes involved in World War II, as the Germans are rebuilding and then pushing through the invasion of Poland, the Netherlands, and Belgium. It's Franklin Roosevelt that brings the big manufacturers to Washington, people like Bill Knudsen from General Motors, people that can manufacture stuff, and then makes it a national priority, gives a big arsenal of democracy speech. So it's pretty clear this is a top 1, 2, or 3 priority for the administration to rebuild its industrial base. If you move to the 1950s, it's a huge push, particularly on nuclear weapons and the delivery vehicles for it, for President Eisenhower, because he's very concerned about a Soviet breakthrough in Central Europe. And then if you fast forward to the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and you look at the Reagan buildup, it is one of his top priorities to push for peace through strength. And strength in that sense really means an industrial push, a big defense buildup. And the end result is hopefully not war, but it's deterrence, it's peace. And so that I think is what has been missing. It's not been a national priority of the last couple of presidents. And what I'm talking about is not just saying it, but also providing the resources, including money, to make defense a priority. That has been missing.
Earlier this month, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a speech about fixing the U.S. system for buying weapons. And it was a detailed hour-long speech in front of defense industry executives saying we need to move faster in taking these ideas and getting them into the hands of troops. We need to take more risk in how we buy weapons, expand our supplier base the way that you're describing. I mean, I think Americans are familiar with all of our many problems in just buying the equipment that we want. There are all sorts of woeful tales about, bathroom soap dispensers on a C-17 that cost us too much, or even bigger late aircraft carriers. I mean, the tales of this are legion. So I wanted to ask you about that speech and whether you've looked at it and how optimistic you are about actually changing our system of over-regulation, of insufficient competition, to just making the buying process better in Washington.
This is an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem in how long it takes to get items on contract. It's an enormous problem in sharing technology with foreign allies and partners, or foreign military sales. I think the regulation involved in everything from building to selling overseas, they're enormous problems right now. In fact, one of the more interesting quotes that I use in the book, and I pull it out at the beginning of one of the chapters, is a book by Andrew Gordon on the Royal Navy, the British Navy, arguing that during periods of peacetime, navies, and I'm equating it to industrial bases, become essentially regulators. But during wartime, you really need to shift to a rat catching or a streamlined environment. And my worry right now is that the U.S. system, it is in a wartime environment because the Chinese industrial base is now operating on a wartime environment. The Russians are as well. They're building en masse. I mean, I was recently in Japan at Kadena Air Force Base, talking with our forward deployed Air Force and Marines and Special Operations Forces inside the First Island chain, just talking through just the masses of equipment, missiles, ships that the Chinese are building. So that's sort of the environment. And it takes way too long to produce. I mean, just look at the shipyards, for example. I've been up to Bath Ironworks in Maine. It takes, one of the DDGs I've kept an eye on, the Arleigh Burke class destroyers. It's triple the original construction timelines for building that ship, and we are in an air-sea battle or deterrence framework with the Chinese in the Pacific. So I do think the secretary and senior Pentagon leadership is talking the right way. But what I'm not seeing yet is those timelines in all cases start to shrink. It's still taking too long within the range of the services, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, to procure systems. So I'm hearing a lot of the right things. What I haven't seen yet is a translation, and it'll take time, and then the money and resources pushed in to do it. So a lot of good talk. We'll see how much that gets translated into action.
Right. I mean, one of the more bracing statistics in your book is one I've heard quantified different ways, but just China has at least 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. It's just enormously dwarfs the U.S. capacity. I think there's one yard in China that has more capacity than the United States, roughly. However you cut that, it's a frightening statistic. But even in your book, when you start to add U.S. allies like South Korea and Japan, who have real shipbuilding expertise, the picture starts to improve for the United States. And so I think what you have articulated is that if the United States wants to expand its military power again, it will need the help of allies, and that it won't be America alone. And so one of my questions is what progress you see on working more closely with our allies. I see mixed progress. I see a lot of reluctance to build actual warships in some of these foreign countries, but which is, I think, unfortunate because the Navy is stuck at 300 ships. It wants to grow. It's not going to get there on the current timeline. But is there a possibility of working more closely with these allies for logistic ships that the U.S. military would inevitably need in a Pacific fight? And how optimistic are you that the U.S. is starting to bring those allies on side to improve our problems?
Well, there has been some limited progress. I mean, the reality, as you note, is less than 1% of commercial and military ships are built in U.S. shipyards. The Chinese are producing over 50%. And then there are significant percentages of ships, so commercial and military ships built by the South Koreans and the Japanese, both of whom are treaty allies of the United States. So I understand, and I think I support the need to probably be careful about some types of ships that you may want U.S. companies to build, very sensitive submarines like the Columbia class that are nuclear submarines, but for a lot of ships, destroyers, frigates, commercial vessels, I just don't know why we can't inject a bit more competition into the marketplace. Because one thing is, I've visited a range of U.S. shipyards, and then you compare it to South Korean and Japanese shipyards. I mean, they are so much further along in some cases on robotics and efficiency and mass production capacity that, for me, this is about comparative advantage. So the U.S. has, in the defense space, has massive capabilities in the space and cyber areas, long-range strike aircraft. It's fifth-generation aircraft like the F-35 and the F-22 are world-leading. And I'm sure with Boeing and the F-47, which is the sixth-generation aircraft, will be world-leading there as well. And we'll export those to allies and partners. But on ships right now, we are not the world leader in shipbuilding. So, some of this may require rethinking legislation like the Jones Act that allows the U.S. to refit, refurbish, and potentially buy more from foreign companies and foreign countries that are ahead of us. There's a little bit of progress with Hanwha buying Philly Shipyard. So having some foreign companies also building in the United States. But the problem there is, there are some big workforce problems in the U.S. defense industry that all of this talk about acquisition reform hasn't solved. Supply chain and workforce issues that are these sort of big extraneous challenges.
I worry a little bit that some of these real deep vulnerabilities that we're talking about in our ability to build ships and build weapons are now being used to say, well, the US should just not meet its commitments around the world, or should reduce its commitments around the world, and America should accept that it's in some level of decline. And I wanted to ask you about that, because I think embedded in your book's argument is a case that free societies are often late to threats, but then they are better at organizing to meet them, that they produce creative thinkers and are better suited than the Chinese Communist Party to meeting real technological and strategic challenges. And so to close this out, I was hoping you could kind of tell me how you think about that tension between our real vulnerabilities and our ability to meet them should we decide to do so.
Well, this gets to the title of the book, The American Edge. The U.S. has a history of, when it puts its mind and resources to the job of defending the country, of actual peace through strength, it has an enormous innovative capacity. It has engineers from some of the most advanced companies in the world that have been able to produce cutting edge technology, from drones to the B-29 bomber to SpaceX and space systems to software platforms that companies like Palantir are putting out. So there's enormous innovation in the United States. At its core, the U.S. is a democracy. It's capitalist, free market, supports freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That sort of culture, I think, is really an important culture for the kind of innovation that becomes important. And I think in the long run, it's a huge vulnerability for a Chinese system that is closed. And I would add the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, Venezuela, and a number of other countries along those lines. When you look at China, its state-owned enterprises are state-run. They're massive inefficiency. There's huge corruption there. And so I think in the long run, the U.S. does have an ability to innovate. And this is kind of the crux of the challenge right now. The Chinese are catching up in a number of key areas, but the U.S. does have what it takes in its innovative private sector to surge and significantly increase that gap, and to get to a point where the Chinese can expand. You actually get peace through strength. And I think all the tools are there. You just need to be used.
Thanks, Seth, author of the important new book, The American Edge. Thanks again, Seth, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's all for today on Potomac Watch. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back on Monday. In the meantime, you can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com.